So, with everything that's been happening in the world over the past few months, particularly in the United States around the Black Lives Matter protests, it seems timely to talk about the right to protest and some of the issues around that as I see it. Um, I'm going to be talking about three high-profile socio-political movements. I say socio-political because I think there's a bit of crossover there. Um, and why I think that it is a mistake that large segments of the media and political establishment seem to think that because protesters are loud, it's only their view that counts. I do think there's this mentality that the right to protest means somehow translates as protesters have the only voice. That's wrong. Um, and there are many, many examples of this. So let me just break this down a bit. The three movements that I'm thinking of: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and Extinction Rebellion. All three movements have been very high profile over the last few years. Obviously, the last few months in particular, it's been Black Lives Matter, but last year it was Extinction Rebellion. The years before that was Me Too. So they've all made their mark. And of course, in this country, we had pro and anti EU demonstrations. There was large demonstrations on both sides. Hopefully, that will. I think it would be naive to say the debate is gone, but hopefully, it will be, less than it was because it's such a divisive issue for this country. Um, and I do hope we're past the point of people being defined as a remainer or a leaver. I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we are, but we'll see what happens when we come out of coronavirus if that becomes an issue again. Um, One thing that I have noticed with Black Lives Matter is just how far the media has gone. And when I say the media, I am talking in a collective sense. There will be a few exceptions, but most big media outlets have basically pandered to this movement. If you look at the way they've reported it, always been in a sort of positive light or an absolutely biased uh, approach. I'm not talking about editorials in newspapers. Newspapers have a bit more leeway because newspapers have always taken a political stance. That's always been the way. But we're seeing this with broadcast media, the BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, um, in the UK, CNN certainly in the United States. Okay, probably Fox News would be more critical, but I would say the majority of mainstream media has been absolutely pro Black Lives Matter. And I think there will be political issues there because there will be a left wing slant with editorial decisions. But I also think that there is a psychology at play here. I think that senior editors in newsrooms feel that they have to have a positive slant. Otherwise, to put it bluntly, they'll be accused of racism. In other words, if they don't wholeheartedly support the movement, then, well, they must be against it. Therefore, they're against progress. And that would be the worst thing for the BBC or Sky News, BBC especially. So, what do? They just pander to it. Um, I've seen this to some extent with third wave feminism, where, and I don't want to dwell too much on this because I think it is a relatively small issue, but it's just an example. Women's Equality Party, it's a very small political party in the UK. Very small because in the two general elections that they've stood in 2017 and 2019, they garnered, I think it was a couple of thousand votes. This is nationwide, okay? I'm not even talking one constituency, I'm talking nationwide. Yet their spokeswomen, and it's all women, um, were given primetime airtime to be interviewed as if they were a significant political force. That's just misleading. Um, that's an example of how those who shout the loudest sometimes get undue influence, to put it bluntly. Um, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not saying that if people are part of a smaller movement or a smaller political party, they shouldn't have any voice. But I think it should broadly correspond to the sort of support that they garner. Um, Now, with me too, again, that's an example because any notion that Me Too is being criticized somehow translated as, men being in denial about the fact that there were predators in Hollywood and other institutions, or men not taking women seriously, or women are not being believed. So there's these distortions that we see in the counter arguments that, in my view, are basically intended to silence critique. Um, Extinction Rebellion, to be fair, has probably got more scrutiny than both Black Lives Matter and Me Too. Um, but still, in my view, not enough. I still don't think that Extinction Rebellion activists have really been put on the spot to the extent they should have. There's been a few examples, but when they have really, really hurt the public, and that is their stated aim, incidentally, um, that goes beyond peaceful protest. The absence of violence does not equate to peace. So just because Extinction Rebellion activists are not, throwing punches and setting fire to things yet, doesn't mean that they're peaceful. If you are causing disruption and stress in people's lives, that is hostile intentions. That is a disruptive thing. It causes a lot of stress. Long-suffering commuters who have their train held up. Um, of course, Extinction Rebellion tried to distance themselves from that. That's kind of the problem with these movements. They are very vocal, and some of the leading figures are very vocal when it comes to galvanizing people. But then when things go badly, they want to wash their hands of it and they won't take any responsibility. So, for example, with Extinction Rebellion, one of the co-founders, Roger Hallam, has openly advocated for anarchy and the overthrow of governments. Yet, when some Extinction Rebellion activists take it on themselves to do things, supposedly the movement has not condoned it. This is the problem. If there's no real organization within a movement, then it is going to be a Frankenstein's monster. Because anyone can then claim to be committing acts in its name. Um, I mean, with Me Too, there's other problems that could be associated with that movement. For example, the prevalence of activists like Linda Sarsour. Sarsour is an absolute Islamist. While she preaches about Islamophobia in the West, she is actively supporting ideological systems that keep women down in Islamic countries. I also think she's very dishonest. I think she's a racist, and I think she's a misandrist. She has shown all these sentiments at different times. Sarsour also supports brutal Islamic laws, yet she has been held up as a spokeswoman of Me Too. That to me is absolutely perverse when there are real feminists in this world, women who are literally risking imprisonment and beating to stand up against very patriarchal, theocratic systems. Where's the solidarity for those women? So that's why I have a problem with Me Too. Well, one of several reasons. I also think it's went too far. I think it's translated serious sexual harassment and assault and rape um, into every exchange between a man and a woman. For example, if you had, let's say, a man put his hand on a woman 10 years ago at a premiere, um, and she had a backless dress, and maybe she felt a little uncomfortable, she told him, he apologized, and that was it. Things like that resurface years later, and they're basically non-issues. Um, so I think Me Too is doing a disservice in some ways to women who really have been say victims, but they're now survivors. They've went through serious problems. There's also the obvious thing that a lot of powerful women have kind of jumped on this movement, the virtue signal, yet they were silent for years. Um, I do think Me Too's went too far. I think it has become about shaming men in general, and basically it's now treating all flirtation as something sinister and to be viewed with in a sinister way. So there might actually be social effects of this whereby men are scared off from flirtation. I mean, men may be reluctant to even approach a woman in a bar because they don't want to be accused of harassment. And then what we'll see down the line is some women will then complain and say, oh, romance is gone, men are no longer romantic. Well, look at Me Too, because it went from trying to hold powerful men like Weinstein to account, which is very legitimate and very important, to basically shaming all acts of flirtation. And if you think that's an exaggeration, just look at some of the sentiments that have been coming through and look at some of the nonsense that has been endorsed by Me Too. There was a case in the UK a few years ago of a lawyer, and she immediately took to Twitter and social media to try and destroy a man who had passed her a compliment. Now, I thought, okay, well, maybe he was being a bit seedy, maybe, it was inappropriate. I looked at the comments that he said, and none of it was explicit. None of it was overtly sexualized. He called her an attractive young woman, and maybe it was inappropriate, but she'd actually initiated contact with him. It's quite a well-known case, Charlotte Proudman. You may be familiar with it if you've been following these things in the UK. But it was a total massive overreaction, and it's an example of how men's reputations can be utterly, utterly trashed just on allegations, and sometimes things being totally taken out of context. Um, Black Lives Matter has obviously been the prominent one over the last few months. Again, if you question Black Lives Matter, especially if you're white, then, oh, well, you must be a racist. You must be a white supremacist. You must be in denial of issues that black people face. Um, I could say I am genuinely concerned about some of the behavior that particular American officers engage in. I can say that there is a real problem affecting black people in many areas. Um, but I have a problem with some of the racism within Black Lives Matter, some of the anti-white racism. So it's pretty preposterous to demand that white people support a movement or be okay with a movement that is telling them they're the enemy. I mean, the late John Lewis had praised Black Lives Matter, which was quite strange because he had been involved in the civil rights movement of the 60s, which of course he was famous for, which was a very inclusive movement. By contrast, Black Lives Matter is very sectarian because it is a very black centric movement. John Lewis and the other civil rights leaders in the 60s were very inclusive. After the beatings at Selma, thousands of white Americans joined in. And yes, there are many white people endorsing Black Lives Matter now, but I think the two situations, the two movements are very different. I think the civil rights movement of the 60s was very inclusive. I think Black Lives Matter is borderline black supremacist. Um, and my basis for saying that is because they will not distance themselves or expel themselves from black supremacists within the movement. So the way I see it is I do not consider that every Me Too activist is a man-hater. I don't consider that every Extinction Rebellion activist is some crazy eco-extremist, and I don't believe that every Black Lives Matter activist hates white people, right? So I try to be open-minded in not looking at everyone who supports these movements as one and the same. But I do think if you are endorsing a movement, you cannot complain about that movement's negative perception to other people if you're being silent at some of the intolerance within the movement. So, as an example, um, Me Too feminists, why are they silent about women in Iran who are risking imprisonment and worse to remove their hijabs? Where is the solidarity for those women? And again, I'm not suggesting that every single person affiliated with Me Too or who endorses Me Too is silent about that, but many of the leaders are. Many of the keynote speakers at the women's marches are utterly silent about the extreme misogyny that goes on around this world. I would suggest the United States, um, Canada, and other Western countries are the best places in this world for women to live. Literally. That's not saying it's perfect, but when you contrast it to some of the things that go on in this world, that's another problem with Me Too. Their focus is entirely on the West. That's not saying the West is perfect, but I think the priority is wrong. Um, I mean, there could be a real cause for Me Too to really highlight issues around the world. I suppose one good thing you could say that's come out of Black Lives Matter and Me Too is it's kind of galvanized movements in other parts of the world in a sense. I know, for example, during the Women's March, there was a similar march in Pakistan. Now, that's a country that certainly needs it. Um, although how much support it had is a question of debate. Likewise, with the Black Lives Matter protests, although I'm very critical of the American and Western movement, it hasn't been entirely bad. I recognise, for example, it has opened up debate and scrutiny of localised cases of police brutality. For example, in parts of Africa, some African countries, there's been local protests against local issues. That's not entirely a bad thing. Not all of this has been about George Floyd and other high profile American cases. So I'm not suggesting that it's all negative, but without question, there is an enormous amount of intolerance to be found in these movements. Me too. Matt Damon was absolutely pilloried for no other reason than saying he felt it had gone too far and it was turning into a witch hunt. So, oh well, he's a man, he must be an enemy. He must therefore support rape. That's the sort of mentality that then resulted in the fact that he'd spoken out. I mean, Matt Damon's pretty much a classic Hollywood actor. He's pretty well to the left politically, from what I gather. He's hardly some sort of right wing reactionary, but that's just an example of how, if you don't toe the line with these movements, they will try to destroy you. This is no joke. Private people could lose their job. Public figures can afford to be a little bit more controversial in most circumstances. As Douglas Murray recently said, he's a public figure. He can take risks that a private person can't because they would lose their job. Whereas Douglas Murray is paid to write. That's what he does. But he recognised that. So I do think there are real issues with this, and I do think the media can be a bit pathetic when they are not doing their job and asking tough questions. So when Black Lives Matter activists and spokespeople are interviewed, why is there not questions about the racism within Black Lives Matter? Why is there not questions about black on black crime? These are valid issues. Um, I mean, the double standards of how that banner in Bury, the banner that was flowing over the game, I think it was in Bury in Lancashire. It said White Lives Matter, and I don't support that particularly, but look at the sheer outrage that was garnered in response to that banner. Sheer outrage, and how dare they? And that's not the standards of the club, and we reject racism of any kind. Yet they're totally okay with pandering to one ethnocentric movement, Black Lives Matter. So there's absolutely double standards to be seen here. And I'm well aware that by speaking out against these movements, I could very easily be portrayed as, oh, well, he's a white guy. He's conservative. He's a reactionary. I'm not particularly conservative, actually. I am white and I am male. Sorry. But I really think that it's troubling to see the tunnel vision of some of these activists. Some of the more hardline activists are profoundly intolerant. Um, and Antifa sort of has straddled all three to some extent. No, I'm not getting into conspiracy theories. I'm not saying they're behind it or anything like that. But, if you look at the antics of Antifa, they pretend to be against fascism when they pretty much behave like fascists, violently assaulting anyone that disagrees with them, demanding that others can't have an opinion. They're a very ugly movement group as- association, and it is difficult to define because they don't have a central leadership. They are very loosely defined. But anyway, I just want to see the media and journalists doing their job a bit more. I'm training to be a freelance journalist, and I will. If I interview people, I'm not sure yet what sort of journalism I'm going to be involved in, if it's going to be just writing up reports, if it's going to be interviews. There's a journalism covers a wide range of things. But if I do interview people, I'm going to be fair, I'm going to be civil, but I am not going to shy away from tough questions because that would be my job as a journalist. And I will not let anyone off the hook. Even people I might be sympathetic with, I will ask questions to play the devil's advocate because it would be my job.